Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming so early to come see me, and thank you to Adobe for having me. My name is Karin Fong, and I work at the intersection of film and design. Let's take a quick look at what that means. All right, thank you, thank you. So as you can see, we've worked on everything from commercial campaigns, brand films, movie marketing, even architectural installations, and the occasional video game. But today, I'm here to speak about our work in main title design. Now, these short pieces of film are among my favorite projects, but I want to talk to them about them today because I think importantly, many of the concepts and principles we use in designing them can be applied to all kinds of design projects. These short pieces are more like poetry, they can tease out an idea, and that's what I think I like most about them, that we can use metaphor to frame stories. They're often more powerful when they aren't literal. So I'm going to take the next hour and speak about my approach to designing main titles and some of the lessons that they can teach us about storytelling. The second most important thing that a main title does is set the tone for the show. And when I say second most important thing, of course, the primary function of the main title is to display the names of the cast and the crew. And so, like many a design project, this one also begins with a legal requirement. And it's a mundane document of that's hashed out between studios and agents and all the players about the size of the names and how long they have to be on. And it's a compulsory thing. But that's kind of the beautiful thing about being a designer, right? That you can take something that is a requirement and imbue it with storytelling qualities. The most successful main titles will prepare an audience for what comes next. And nowhere is this more important than when you're setting up a comedy. You have to give the audience permission to laugh. I'm going to take you back to one of my earliest projects, this one based on an urban myth. Maybe you know it. Apparently when you're in college, if you have a roommate who commits suicide, you get straight A's for the term, for all your emotional trauma. So the premise of this film was that these two flunkies were going to find the most suicidal guy on campus to room with them. We started by thinking about all the ways that we could combine suicide and college and came up with the metaphor of the SAT, in this case, the suicide aptitude test, which allowed us to write the credits right into the body of the title, into the fabric of the film. And so we had quite a bit of fun with this, as you can see, inventing these diagrams. I found it kind of disturbing that the editor actually requested this one. I don't know what that bodes for the film. And I found with this project, as well as many more after, is that the more specific the design is, the better. In fact, one of the things I'll ask myself and my team is, can this main title be attached to any other show? And if the answer is yes, let's say you're working on a cop show and you can slip out, you can keep the picture but slip out the title and give it another name and it still works, chances are that what you've made is too generic and you have to go back and dive a little bit deeper. Now, this can be a particular challenge when working on a sequel, right? Because in a sequel, you want to connect to the fan base and what they've seen before and what they love about it and all the things that are familiar. But you also want to give it something unique in its own twist. This certainly was the case when working on Spider-Man: No Way Home. Now, the first thing that you need to do is talk to the director, right? This is the first step into finding out all the themes and ideas of a film to make it ownable. So our conversation started with director John Watts, and as this is the third film in his trilogy, he had very specific ideas of what it should be. In terms of the aesthetic, the first two Spider-Man in the trilogy had end titles that had a very hand-done aesthetic. And so we knew that we had to use that kind of stop-motion analog language, as if Peter Parker and his teenage friends had made them themselves. But John brought us to the very specific place that this story begins, or this story occurs. He told us that in this third film, the friends were all finishing at their science high school and looking forward to attending MIT. So we could go back to the familiar aesthetic for this end title, but now we had math as a major theme to add to the narrative. And so with that jumping off point, we entered what I think is the most fun part of any project, is doing all the research. And we'll look at everything. For right now, you're looking at some vintage textbooks and diagrams. And we also, not just look at things, but also think back to how we were as teenage artists, right? Remember learning the first time about one-point perspective and how to draw in 3D and the doodles you would make on your notebooks. Impossible figures. Who didn't have a poster of MC Escher on their wall, right? And be thinking about all these ideas. And then the funny thing is when you're working on a story, then everything seems to have relevance. You look at a Fibonacci spiral and suddenly you see Doc Ock's tentacles, or the kind of space-time torus of grid suddenly looks like Spider-Man. And we immediately went into animation as well, because, like I said, we wanted to take that hand-done aesthetic, but also update it dimensionally with CG. And incorporating a lot of this sort of stop-motion aesthetic throughout the whole sequence. And I have to mention that working on an end title sequence can be very different from doing a main title, right? Because now you're at the end of the film, and there are no more secrets to be revealed. In fact, this one had a very big secret. The first two Spider-Mans, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, were going to join Tom Holland in this, and this is a closely guarded, kind of surprise. But it was really fun to think about all the situations that the three Spider-Men could play together and kind of tip our hat to that multiverse. And again, it was such a pleasure to bring in all kinds of illustration references that I'd admired before. Well, one thing John Watts, the director, wanted us to make sure of is that we wouldn't be, too in our heads, right? This, again, was an end title sequence, and we wanted a celebratory mood as the audience left the theater. The movie ends on a bittersweet note, and so it was part of the objective to get the tone up. And he had us also celebrate the legacy of Spider-Man by looking at the drawings of Steve Ditko, who had wonderfully exuberant shapes and colors, and that was very important to remember that though we had this big concept of math, that we would include these things to give it the tone it needed. So let's take a look at the end titles for Spider-Man: No Way Home. Thank you, thank you. That was a fun one. So while we're on the subject of superheroes, I thought I'd mention that filmmaking is an extremely collaborative process, and if there's one piece of advice I would give anybody entering this business is to always work with people better than you are, which I have the great fortune of being able to do. And being in the film industry, our team, sometimes people think, maybe our lives look like this. But in reality, they look most of the time like this. Everybody brings their own superpower, whether a designer, a filmmaker, a musician, producer, editor, and we work together. And it's a great, lucky thing in my life that I get to work with people who have such a deeply value concept and craft. And speaking of, how you make something definitely affects how the story feels, right? Like the way our craft is very expressive of the narrative. And there's no better example that I can give than our work for the titles for the Apple TV series Lisey's Story. It's based on a Stephen King book. It's about a woman who is widowed. Her husband was a very famous mystery thriller suspense author, kind of like Stephen King himself. And he dies, and she is haunted by his madness, his rabid fan base, his manuscripts. She's tethered by this, relationship with him and her past. And the director, Pablo Larraín, came to us already with a pretty strong metaphor. He wanted to have us express Lisey's emotional life with either dolls or puppets. And so again, we went right into researching of what that could possibly look like. What could this puppet of Lisey and Scott, what could that be based on? And we found this wonderful French fashion mannequin, and we loved the way that the features were elongated and elegant, and it seemed like we could get our Lisey, our Julianne Moore as Lisey, in this figure. Now, I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit how we present ideas, that there's a drama and a story unfolding even when you pitch. One thing that we decided in the beginning was that we'd make a puppet of Lisey. My co-director, Osbert Parker, knew somebody who'd made puppets, and we thought immediately we would make a Lisey puppet that we would send to the director, thinking that once he held her in his hands and touched her and felt the weight and the tactile and the physicality of this puppet, that he would buy into our idea that this should not be a CG sequence, but one done in live action with puppeteers. So we sent her off to Chile, but before that, photographed her and tried to devise the visual language of this puppet show, right? Well, it must have worked because soon we were on our way to devising a storyboard and a narrative for this title sequence. And thinking about how this could play out. How could this puppet express the ways that Lisey was tethered by her emotions and held back and eventually break free? And what we decided was that the strings would be just as important as the puppets themselves, right? The strings of the marionette could express some of these things. And here we are with some Photoshop frames, let's combine some CG and some shot elements to try to devise different ways that we can see Lisey's journey. And we were always keeping an eye out on analog techniques. These are some frames from a very famous sequence of Orpheus by Jean Cocteau, where a man travels through a mirror, but really goes through water. And we also looked at the film effects of Salvador Dali, because there's a story point that was very important, where Lisey can actually visit her dead husband's imagination by transcending a water transition. So we want to allude to that, but do it, in a very practical way. Practical meaning in camera. And then at the same time, there was also the business of designing the specific puppets. We first went to traditional puppet makers, and we even modeled some things in wood and in clay. But these things would prove to be too heavy at the size we needed for our performance. And so we turned to CG and started design the puppets with the idea that we would 3D print them, which would be much lighter. And this became a sort of an advantage because we could work back and forth with the puppeteers on how they would be engineered to make sure that these puppets could do the things that we asked of them in the storyboard, as well as dial in specific features that make Clive Owen and Julianne Moore's characters, Lisey and Scott, immediately recognizable, but still stylized in the way a traditional marionette would be. And you might ask, why would you do this when you could do this in CG? But I think because it was such an emotional story that we wanted to bring that humanity into the piece, right? And sometimes that's something that isn't necessarily seen but felt. And I have to say, one of the great pleasures of working on this job was actually working with the puppeteers and seeing how they would bring Lisey and Scott to life. And as far as like that water transition as well, we didn't know exactly what would happen when you pull the puppet through the water, right? But that's sort of the point of shooting, right? You get all these idiosyncrasies and these things that happen that give you that sense of humanity. So now, if we can take a look at the titles for Lisey's story. Thanks. I spend so much time thinking of the way things that can transition. It was such a delightful thing when I could experience a transition in real life, and that was the case when I was invited to go see the set of Boardwalk Empire. So you imagine I was living in New York at the time, and you'd go to Brooklyn, and you'd see these shipping containers on this sort of dock area of Brooklyn, and lo and behold, when you went around them, you would see this whole set built for the HBO series of a life-size boardwalk of Atlantic City, the setting of the show. And it was a spectacular set. There were all these stores, you could walk in and out. One even had a working taffy maker, and the production design was just out of this world. All the vintage signage and every detail just right. And so one of the first things I did was take a tour and take some photography, which we then put together into a storyboard and animatic, and just show all the aspects of the boardwalk, because the creator Terry Winters had told me this boardwalk is a microcosm of America of the time. It's a story set between the two world wars. It's the Roaring '20s, and there's commerce, but there's corruption, there's politics, there's a rising middle class, there's an underbelly, there's all these themes of the boardwalk. And the story centered on a character named Nucky Thompson, played by Steve Buscemi, who was kind of what we called the boardwalk czar. And so our concept here, as you can see, is him walking the boardwalk. We would never actually show Nucky himself, right? But we would see what he saw as he walked his empire from dawn to dusk, or into the night. And so it was extremely exciting. I mean, one of the great things about working in this is working with some of the best of the industry's designers, meaning like the production designers and costume designers, and you would just not believe the detail that, for instance, the costume designers would put together. And we were suddenly putting together a shoot with like many extras, and they were, preparing all the vintage hosiery, and there would be dead stock, wool, and they would be making into suits, and it was just fantastic. And then we got the note as I was, preparing, and understandably, I was super excited to shoot this. We got the note that wasn't what HBO and Terry wanted at all. And I was a little bit shocked that they didn't want this beautiful montage that, to me, said so much about their show. But here's the thing, that we were showing many, many themes and ideas that the show touched upon, but we hadn't distilled a strong idea that would make people sit up and take notice. And though they didn't say it at the time, what they were really looking for is some sort of origin story, right? Something that set this whole thing up. For despite all the things I had mentioned, all the storylines, people would come and go, characters would change, there would be themes that go out throughout the whole series, but the center of all of it would be Nucky, and the constant would be change. And furthermore, they wanted us to look at this story through the lens of liquor, because it was liquor that made Atlantic City rise and fall at this time. It was a time of prohibition, and Atlantic City's position on the eastern seaboard made it perfect for rum running. Right? So smugglers would bring in liquor, and that's what made Nucky's fortunes change. So we went back to the drawing board, and how could we express this visually? And we finally came up with this sketch where Nucky would look out into the ocean and see hundreds of bottles rolling towards him. And this would be him literally seeing his his fortune arrive on shore in the form of liquor. And so we went to work with a completely 180 on this, right? We were going to shoot this amazing set design in Boardwalk, but now we were going to just shoot Steve Buscemi as the eye of the storm. And I have to say, I learned a lot from this. I have to really admire the way HBO and Terry pushed us to think of a metaphor that was of the show but didn't duplicate anything about it, right? There's nothing surreal. There's no special effect like this in the show. It's a drama. There aren't these surreal moments, but it told me that it's okay and even preferable sometimes to create something that asks more questions than it answers. In fact, one of the most satisfying things about working on this project was that the series ran for several years, and it was sometimes during season 3 or 4, people would say to me, "Now I really get what those titles were about." And so it was nice to make something that sort of grew with the show. So if we could take a look at Boardwalk Empire. Thank you. Now, here's another time when I had to double back to figure out what the title needed to be, and this time for entirely different reasons. This was for the film The Cat in the Hat, which was a main title interpretation of the Dr. Seuss book, starring Mike Myers. And what it featured, again, was amazing production design, this time by Alex McDowell, who interpreted the whimsical world of Dr. Seuss into a huge 3D set. And then our idea from the get-go was always to see what was inside the cat's brain, right, inside that big hat, imagining that there would be a Rube Goldberg machine inside, clinking and clanking along and creating the credits, right? And all in that, a 3D language that, that tipped our hats to the original, but also introduced this stylish new aesthetic. And again, we had to go back. This time, because Mike Myers and Bull Welch, who was the director, had screened the film and thought, this is not what audiences need in the beginning of a book, in the beginning of a movie based on The Cat in the Hat. No, you don't want to do that. You don't want to assault the audience with a new aesthetic. You want to bring them back to the original. I'm going to say a pause here to say that it's always important to be constantly listening to the work, right? You can storyboard and script all you want, but you always have to be listening to what the story needs at the time. And in this case, the audience needed to go back to childhood. When you go to a movie based on a Dr. Seuss book you love, you want that feeling, at least for a moment, that feeling you have of sitting in your parents' lap and enjoying that book. And so only after we return to the past and those familiar things could we launch the audience into this new world. And so instead of that 3D interpretation, we used the iconography or the language of Dr. Seuss in a much more direct way, but that didn't mean that we didn't have fun with it, right? We got permission to alter the logos, and so it gave you an entrance to that Dr. Seuss world from the very first frame of film. And this project it kind of taught me another thing. It's like sometimes when I'm thinking of something that I want to make a splash, right? I'm trying to think of being clever and being original, and I'm thinking about techniques that are new. Sometimes when I'm concentrating too much on those things, we can miss important opportunities to connect with an audience, right? Now, I've been talking a lot about how we imbue different stories with mythic qualities. But in this case, we're actually dealing with myth with a capital M. And this was is an end title for the Disney Plus series, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, which is based on a book series by Rick Riordan. And it's basically the story of Percy, who finds out that he is the son of Poseidon. And so he goes to Camp Half-Blood, and he meets a lot of other kids who also have gods and demigods as their parents, right? And one of the first things that the show creators, the showrunners, Don Steinberg and Dan Schutz, told us was that this is really a big dysfunctional family, right? It's a family drama, and it's all the things that come with that. And so one of the first things we did was like, okay, let's try to visualize that. Let's look at different ways that we can see the Greek family tree, and this is one of them here. And then we're looking at different ways that we could represent these, outsized personalities, right? These characters. These are stylized versions of traditional symbols used in Greek mythology. And then we thought, well, let's make this whole board be this kind of crafted schematic of Percy and all the complicated relationships of the family and and the power struggles in Greek mythology. And we start with Percy's sword, and then travel in this kind of mystical way. Some of this hand-done craft aesthetic were based on the idea that maybe the kids are, making things at Camp Half-Blood. There's a little bit of craftiness implied here. A little allusion to Athena hiding the symbols inside a lot of these diagrams, and just having fun about all the ways that we could see the characters connect, whether it was like the power triumvirate triumvirate of Jupiter, of Zeus, Neptune and Hades, Poseidon and Hades, and just giving it this interpretation. Now, let's look at this sequence with some of the things we've been talking about, right? I stand by these frames. I think they're beautiful and striking. But ask ourselves, could this go in front of any other film or be a title for any other property on Greek mythology? Well, maybe it possibly could go on something like Clash of the Titans or some interpretation, right? And most importantly, what is the tone? This is also an end title. And John and Dan were saying, you know what, this is something that should celebrate the series, and also be applicable from people who are 8 years old up. In fact, they brought back the idea that maybe this shouldn't be so much in our heads, right? Maybe it was a bit cerebral. Basically, I think this metaphor just wasn't big enough for the story. One thing that we had missed, actually, in that concept is the idea that this doesn't take place in Greece at all. It doesn't take place in ancient Greek. It takes place in modern America. For those of you who know the story know that Mount Olympus is actually on the top floors of the Empire State Building. But luckily, my co-director on this project, Tosh Kadama, had brought to that same meeting a reference of a mural by Diego Rivera. There was something about murals and the way they're in classic American buildings, like in the lobbies, right, in big banks or the Empire State Building or Chrysler Building, that spoke to us. And it really resonated with John and Dan, right? There's something about the way there's multiple perspective and there's mysterious things happening. You get this idea of a big, glorious history. And we looked more and more at murals of the time, particularly between the 20s and 40s. And you can see it's great because it's a very American art form, right? And it could depict things and make them larger than life. I mean, the whole point is to make these ideas and scenes immortal. And of course, with Percy Jackson, we actually are dealing with immortals. And so the work of creating a mural that we could imagine being in the Empire State Building started to form, and we started to collage some ideas. And then we worked with and here, Art Deco, huge influence. This was Urte, taking some reference from these fashion drawings. And we worked with this amazing illustrator, Jorge Artola, who is a wizard with Adobe Illustrator, and he started to work with all these drawings based on our references. This is Percy's horse, and some study for the Furies, again, based on a lot of Deco references that we had drawn. And made these elaborate sort of murals that we then, no offense to Adobe Illustrator, we did not want to make look like vector. So we spent a lot of time painting them with textures to make them appear as if on a wall. And so now we can take a look at Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Thank you. Now I'm going to address that elephant in the room. It might be the number one question I get about designing title sequences. How do I feel when people skip the titles? Well, I guess I have to say we're all trying to make things that are compelling, right? We're all working to not be skipped, right? Except that in my industry, there just happens to be a button for it. Now, the onus is on us to make something compelling, right? Something people want to stick around for. And so I say, of course, I don't want you to skip the titles, and out of solidarity to my to title design and other designers and the cast and the crew, I happen to sit through all of the titles, even when I'm binging, sometimes even the end credits, which can, threatens to drive my family a little crazy. But in reality, I have to say that though they have their job at the beginning or attached to these films and shows, we often experience them as viral things, right? Or things that are passed along, or when they're not attached to the show. And I have to argue that maybe they even have more power in our culture as mnemonics, right? And existing in a place where we're away from watching the actual show. Here we have Mad Men, and the iconography for that, right, is immediately recognizable, becoming not only part of the cultural landscape, but actually the physical landscape, in this case, of New York City. And with the title, and then a lot of it, I'll give credit to the music, but you can hear the strains of the music, see the typography, and it's often a very visceral and emotional reaction, right? It's one way that the show can plant its flag, in the real world and connect us, right? And they can be memes, right? They can go viral. There's a lot of connection you get with your community when these things hit. And we're not above a meme ourselves. But, you can't control, right? There's no way you can actually control what resonates with an audience. But sometimes you just get these clues from the universe that you're doing something right. I'm going to play a final piece of video. It was something that, that I was thrilled to see. It was it made me think, oh my goodness, we should all be so lucky as to be parodied by our heroes. So if we could play this, if we could take a look. Thank you so much. Now, I know that the audio sometimes couldn't be included for the pieces for various copyright issues. So if you take this QR code or the link, you can see the pieces and in their entirety. Thanks.